Good afternoon and welcome to this talk on designing local culture-led strategies. Today we have a real pleasure to have with us Arthur Le Gall, who is Director of KEA European Affairs. Well, I think KEA doesn't need an introduction, but I will still say that over the past 2 decades, a bit even more than that, you have been accompanying a lot of cities and regions, but also national governments in Europe, but also beyond, when they wanted to design a policy for cultural and creative sectors or a culture-led local development strategy. And you've been working closely also with the European Commission here in Europe in advising them on the different methodological approaches and also in measuring the footprint of the sector. So we think really KEA is a go-to place for many of us, for cities and regions, for national governments, when people start thinking about putting in place either a national framework to support creative sectors or designing indeed a city strategy to focus on unleashing this transformative power, as we say, of culture and creative sectors for all sorts of reasons. So thank you so much for joining us. And well, let's maybe have a look at your presentation. But before we go into the details, and I know you would like to cover different issues, well, I guess one of the big questions we want to ask ourselves here, after this couple of decades of different experimentation with culture-led planning, what are the key lessons now that a planner should be aware of when someone is trying to design and put in place a new culture-led development strategy? So maybe that's the big question that we'll be discussing today during this talk. What we would maybe do in your presentation, of course, it will be great to start with a bit of a definition, what we're talking about when we say cultural and creative sectors, what are these? And then maybe what is the argument there? Why, in fact, to invest in these sectors? Why a culture-led development strategy? And then all these lessons learned and from what are the steps in when someone wants to design a strategy, so a step-by-step strategy design process, something like that. And then indeed the lessons learned from the past in a way, this problem-solving way that I saw you will present in the presentation. But maybe before we go into all that, maybe you can also say a few words about the KEA to start with. Arthur, please.
Oh, many thanks, Ekaterina and OECD for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you and to discuss about these topics. So today, we'll talk about designing cultural policies, which is what we've been doing for more than 20 years at KEA. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll bit about our experience so far on doing that. So we've been working a lot since 1999 on those topics. We've been working also at different levels, European level, national level, cities and regions, but also directly with the cultural and creative sectors itself. So the question is, why are we doing all this? Why do we want to develop cultural policies and cultural strategies in the first place? So go to the next slide. I think we always feel that, let's say, designing cultural policy is always a sort of match between first kind of public policy objectives. And when we say public policy objectives, we talk about cultural policy objectives, but also much wider development strategies. So we can talk about, let's say, quality of life in the city, which is, of course, highly dependent on culture, but also on other factors. We can talk about generating innovation, which is something which goes beyond the remit of culture and creativity. But what we always say is that culture is a driver for all those various elements and those various public policy objectives. So the question on why should we do it? Well, first, because it is part of all the things that you want to do for any given city, region, or even country. And so it can also contribute, obviously, to the local economy. We'll get to that again very soon. But beyond those kind of policy objectives, I would say that there are some sort of intrinsic value as well to the cultural and creative sectors. I'm not going to go into all the definition work, and there are multiple resources on that. But when you look at this picture, for instance, here, you see the diversity first of the sectors that we cover. So be it in terms of music, performing arts, audiovisual, fashion, design, video games, there is a high diversity there. Some of them are also very much economically driven. And if you look at simple figures, looking at the value added, we are talking about 413 billion euros in the EU, or again, 9 million people employed, so which is more than 6% of the workforce of the EU. So the question, why should we care? And the first easy answer is to say, well, it's not that we should care. It's because it's obvious that it's a core economic sector. It's equivalent to, for instance, the ICT sector and the accommodation and food services. So beyond all the kind of very important qualitative aspects, the contribution of culture to so many policy areas, the first thing we should say is that we should care because it's something that is already there and that is already a core part of our economy and society. That would be the first thing to say. Yeah. But then if we look at why we should invest, it has a culture as what we sometimes call a spillover effect, right? So let's say it's consequences beyond, let's say, the cultural sector itself. So when you look at everything you care for in a city, when you talk about urban regeneration, when you talk about social cohesion, when you talk about attractiveness of any given city, cultural investment sort of triggers positive impacts in all of these elements. And it's important to invest in the cultural and creative sectors, and very importantly for cities, one key message is you're the first investors in the cultural and creative sectors. Cities and regions are, when you look at all the combined figures, cities and regions are the one which are catering to the needs of the cultural and creative sectors the most in terms of, say, annual budgets and so on. So cultural investment matters, and cities are sort of best placed also to invest in culture and to design the right policies and projects. Go to the next slide.
Maybe if I may add here after, you underlined, well, why investing in culture, because it's already an economic sector on its own, and also because of these spillovers that go to, well, urban regeneration, so social cohesion, quality of life, and many other areas of social and indeed economic impact. And I guess now what we can underline as well is that there is increasing evidence on these impacts, because maybe we were saying this, the arguments on the importance of culture across these different areas for a number of years, but now there is indeed quite an evidence there that underpins all these statements. So.
Indeed, and well, you have contributed to that as well as OECD is also doing lots of studies and research on improving this evidence base. On our side as well, we conduct regular economic analysis of the sector, and I think indeed that's also a very important point. I tend to forget about this because we are all so busy with working with that. But it's kind of new as well. The kind of economic analysis of culture is a relatively new field, at least in terms of using that for policy purposes. I think our first study on the economy of culture in Europe was in 2006. There were some studies before that at national level, for instance, in the UK or France. But it's quite recent if we look at the history of public policies, right? And today we see more and more of these studies. We regularly do it at EU level. We often do it also for specific countries and cities. And that is very important as well when designing public policies. Understand what you have in your own territory. And in fact, that's a perfect transition to what I want to discuss on this slide, which is when you want to take the risk of cultural investment, when you are willing to design cultural policies, there are some key steps you can take. Some key ingredients, I call them, that you can mobilize to design those. It's not a one size fit all checklist, but those are kind of core elements that you will find everywhere. So the second point is about understanding your cultural resources, and very often that's what you need to do is first to perform a study and analysis of what you have, be it in economic terms, but also in terms of analysis of your local stakeholders, what what kind of heritage resources do you have in your territory? So there are lots of different ways of doing that, but the core element should be have a firm understanding of your own cultural resources. And they are diverse as well. There are, let's say, cultural and creative companies, there are cultural operators, there are grassroots associations, there are also intangible, let's say, heritage or intangible cultural values, let's say. For instance, you can think of, let's say, festivals, music that is particularly prominent in your own city. So there are many forms, shapes of cultural resources, and it's important to understand them all.
Well, yeah, yes, it's not a, well, you mapped them a little bit, but indeed that seems so important, and as they are so diverse, it's more difficult to do this than any other sectoral analysis or sectoral mapping, I guess. So yes, indeed, a cultural planner would start with mapping this, and then maybe also trying to understand what is the comparative advantage of his territory somehow, and that's maybe even more difficult, I guess, than just mapping your own resources.
Indeed, and I think that's a very important point as well, because when I say understand your cultural resources, it also has to do with this kind of comparative advantage. What's the uniqueness that you have? And I always say that even to smaller cities, even to villages sometimes, each place has its own resources, and very often there is a unique spin you can take on cultural policy. That's why you really require more in-depth analysis and understanding of the local context. But there is always something unique that you can build up on. And I'll get to the step-by-step guide as well to explain a bit how we usually, let's say, proceed to understand this uniqueness of the territory. We call it sometimes the genius loci, the unique quality of the place, let's say. But there are other components as well. I won't go into all the details, but one very important thing as well, especially for policymakers out there, one key thing is really the kind of leadership vision, develop a sort of strategic blueprint that will then enable all your staff, all your cultural stakeholders to sort of embark on a journey together to develop really a cultural policy together, and not just try to develop something without having a clear focal point which says culture matters for us. So having this kind of first understanding, first leadership is very important to then get people on board and get things moving. There are other tips here, but I think I won't necessarily go into all of them. I just want to flag one, which is the accidental encounters, which is very important as well. Because we can plan cultural policy, we can design them, and that's part of our job at KEA. But an important point is also about enabling things to take place. It's about letting go. It's about creating the sort of framework conditions for cultural projects, cultural activities to take place. But at some point, the networking of people, the right people at the right place, will create something that you haven't planned, and that would be in many cases greater than what you expected. That's also something very important. Just create the right conditions. So that would be one important point. But then, yeah, we can go to the next steps. There are different approaches to cultural policy design, and what I'm going to say is kind of personal to KEA. I'm not saying we are the only ones doing it that way, but that's at least our own approach. On our side, we consider that we need to articulate cultural policies around three main principles. The first one is it's about participatory design of cultural policies. So we work, of course, with cities, with policymakers, but we also consult, develop policies with local cultural operators, because they will be the ones at the end of the day that will be the, let's say, implementing arm of cultural policies. They will be the ones doing with you. So get them on board from the beginning. Otherwise, whatever you develop will need to be fine-tuned and reviewed afterwards. So opening up participation from the get-go will just save time in the end. We try to be pragmatic. We love culture, but at the same time, we know that resources are not unlimited. So when we develop cultural strategies and when you develop cultural strategies, bear in mind that you don't have, in most cases, let's say, unlimited amounts of money. So we take into account the financial, but also the strategic constraints. So for instance, if you have to combine, let's say, your work with the work of national government, you need to understand their own strategy as well, for instance. And then we are holistic, which means that when we design cultural policies, in fact, we design much more. We design cultural policies, we design social policies, we design entrepreneurship policies, so environmental policies as well now. So cultural policies are much more than they are, and that's something we take on board when we help you to design them. We have a sort of step-by-step guide that I'm going to briefly run you through.
So if I may, I wanted to go back maybe to the previous slide and ask you one question. Well, here you were speaking about this holistic approach to cultural policy design, and sometimes we also use this word integrated policy approach or whatever. And from our work on employment policies, in fact, here at the OECD on the decentralization of employment policies, or how they can be better adapted to local conditions and respond to really local needs. We were seeing for the last couple of decades that were, of course, a lot of local employment partnerships, for example, emerging on the ground, which are now mainstreamed across Europe, and they exist also in many other OECD countries. And these partnerships, they try to align of course, the employment policy, but also with the employer's needs, the skills needs that are there on the market, with the training provisions, and also with the community needs, with also some kind of objectives on social inclusion. And what we saw, and everyone of course is saying, well, let's work in partnerships, partnerships are important, but we see that when many of these different policymakers come back to their offices, they don't have enough flexibility within their policies in terms of budget management or target setting to really put in place these partnership approaches, which do require quite some flexibility in the management of policies. So we have a whole stream of work on how to inject flexibility in the employment policies to allow this adaptation to the local needs and this partnership working. I don't know if this kind of story and argument resonate with you when we think about how to go for this holistic cultural policy design.
It certainly does, and I think when I said being pragmatic and strategic constraints, you nailed it here. Because yes, very often what happens as well is that you talk about, let's say, developing cultural policies that have social impacts. And very often the social department will be on board if we're talking about a city. But the issue is not necessarily about convincing people, but it's very often to understand the boundaries and the, let's say, limits that you face. So there are different tools and tips, let's say, to address that, but very often we see this kind of issue when you develop cross-sectoral cooperation. How can we do that in practice, and how can we overcome the, let's say, boundaries that were designed on our own mandate in a way, because at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. We have a mandate, we need to do something in relation to that, and what goes beyond is not something that we can easily integrate in our daily work. So we've seen different models to address that. One of them is first to work with what we call arm's length bodies, so independent structure that will sort of implement some of the cultural policy actions, but that it is very often a public body or a privately owned body with a public mission that will have more flexibility in terms of way of working and in terms of doing things. That's one solution. The other solution is sometimes to create, let's say, task forces within the administration. So you sort of extract some of your staff from let's say the traditional organigram and mandate that you have. So you create a sort of cross-department task force that will look into culture and any other, let's say, aspects. Very often we do that when it comes to designing creative economy strategies, because very often you have the issue that it's not necessarily the mission of the cultural department, but it's not entirely the mission of the economic department. So very often you need to have a sort of either task force or way of working that allows for more flexibility, and most importantly also allows all the right people to be around the table. Because then you have the right skills, you've got and ultimately you will have the right policies and tools. So that's a very good point. Yeah, if we go to the kind of main steps to designing cultural policies, again, it's our own take, and we always tailor that. It's just a general approach that we use as a basis, as a kind of foundation. But we've got 6 steps. The first one is to brief, understand what is going on, what are the needs of the city, what are the specificities of the cultural sectors, cultural and creative sectors. Look at the type of outcomes you want to achieve. So where do you want to go through cultural and creative industry policies? And we run some analysis, a bit of benchmarking very often as well. And we try to find a consensus with the city, the policymakers, to understand, okay, this is where we want to go. So basically it's the first step to setting up a vision, which is our 3rd step. But it's really the first point. Understand where you're going together. The second step is what we discussed earlier. Understand the local cultural resources, the ecosystem. Very often it's kind of a mix between our own research and then discussions with local stakeholders to make sure that whatever we find is confirmed by let's say local stakeholders. We often work in partnership as well, because we work all over Europe and beyond. So whenever we do something, it needs to be locally tailored, and we work either with local partners or through local consultations. Then it's about setting out a vision. So the idea is really to elaborate on the first 2 steps and put that all together in this kind of big picture vision where we want to go, and make sure that this is kind of commonly agreed across all parties, so policymakers, cultural stakeholders, and even sometimes citizens association. The idea is really to have a common ground on which you will build up. Okay. If we look at the next steps, then we have the actual work, which is about developing the strategy. So we've got the vision, and then the strategy is all about developing a program of measures that will achieve the goals that are set out in the vision. Then, of course, lots of discussions and exchanges to make sure that these different tools and instruments are well adapted to the city. So it might be considering the budget constraints, it might be also the mandates of the different departments. So that's where we get to the nitty-gritty details, and all the barriers and constraints need to be taken into account. And here, importantly as well, you develop indicators, you develop ways to monitor and pilot the projects that you will develop afterwards. It doesn't need to be all set in stone, but you need to have ways of evaluating and reiterating your strategy quite frequently to make sure that it's always still well adapted to your context. Then we develop the action plan. That's an important part as well, because that's where also you will really assign actual tasks to different departments, to the administration. That's where you will notice who should be in charge and how. So that's an important point. And that's also about developing a timeline, making sure that all the components sort of fall into place. Then implementation is about doing, and that's where we as consultants, we usually leave, but we don't leave like this. We leave with, let's say, a kind of toolkit, and we also leave by sort of trying to empower cultural operators. So the main thing is about making sure that there is a dialogue between the city and the cultural and creative sectors. That's something that should be there for the long run. And that means as well that you need to build capacity, because very often what we see, especially in smaller places, in smaller cities, you see that you've got one or two cultural organizations, but it's not very well structured. It's more kind of personal relationships, which is great, but at the same time, you need sometimes to have some sort of formalized association in order to avoid the kind of personality issues, the kind of barrier, the kind of blockades that you may see if it becomes too personal. So building capacity is really important when designing cultural policies, and that's something we always take on board when developing strategies. And of course, there are some details about communication and making sure you reach out to all the right people, but that's a less important aspect, I would say, or rather, it's an aspect which is embedded in many ways of working. You can just go back quickly to the last previous slide. I'll just very quickly introduce you to some shared resources. Yeah, this one. To design CCI's policies, because we said earlier, well, it's fairly new. At least the economic dimension of culture is fairly new. We haven't necessarily researched that for ages, but today we've got lots of resources we can use. I've just listed a few here because I've been directly involved in those, but there are many more. And in fact, at the OECD, you also have lots of resources for local economic development, and that's something I'm sure you will share with participants as well. On our side, we've been working quite actively on let's say, peer learning projects to help designing cultural policies. So here I've listed 2 cultural cities and regions, and the kind of successor to this project, which is Cultural Heritage in Action. Both projects were about peer learning, sharing knowledge between cities and regions on cultural policies or cultural heritage policies. They were both funded by the European Commission, by the Creative Europe program, I should say it. And there are sort of gold mine with catalogs of good practices. I think we've got more than 100 in total, 70 for the first project, 30 for the second one. And we've got lots of also reports from peer learning visits, which are all very comprehensive and all focusing on specific topics. So I really invite people to have a look at the website. If you click on the Cultural Heritage in Action logo, you will access the website. It's really goldmine for people who are trying to develop new policies and projects. There is also the Cultural and Creative Cities Monitor developed by the JRC, Joint Research Center, of the European Commission. And that one is more quantitative. It's more about analyzing, let's say, key metrics for, let's say, creative cities. It's useful to have a kind of quick benchmark on where does your city stand, and also to look at the examples they provide. So it's also a good resource I can recommend. And then, yeah, I realize I'm talking too long. That's always the issue when you're passionate about the topic. Just wanted to share a few things from this Cultural Heritage in Action project. I just wanted to flag a few things. First is kind of what are the key issues we are trying to address through cultural policies, and in that case, cultural heritage policies. I've listed a few of them here, but it's really about showing that cultural heritage goes beyond cultural heritage buildings or cultural heritage activities. It's always about solving wicked social issues. It's always about job creation. It's always about enabling dialogue with citizens and different communities. So when we talk about cultural heritage policies, it's always about something that goes beyond that. And we are addressing issues that are much more prominent for our society than just sustaining a heritage building. We are talking about something that is bigger than this. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that also a few key trends. It's all from, let's say, what around 100 cities and regions have been telling us through this project. We'll just flag a few things here. First, cultural heritage is more and more embedded in local regional strategies. So when we say cultural policies go beyond their own remit, we see that it's more and more the case. We see that in, let's say, the big roadmaps of cities, it's more and more prominent. And that's also a lesson learned for any city that wants to develop its own policy. There is a lot of inspiration you can take from other cities and regions. Another important element is that we talked about cross-department cooperation, and heritage is often a very good example of that. Because very often you've got this sort of mix between national authorities, which often have a sort of system for listed heritage. So you very often need to cooperate between cities, regions, and national governments. So you already have a kind of a multi-level governance aspect. And very often you also have a cross-department element here, because sustainable heritage is always about cultural policies, but also urban policies. And very often you also have a lot of environmental dimensions coming in. So you really need to work across departments, and heritage is in fact quite powerful in facilitating that, because by nature, because of international standards as well, such as UNESCO guidelines for listed sites, you have the kind of mandate to involve many different departments in your work. So heritage works well as a kind of trigger for cross-sectorial cooperation, let's say. Now if we go to the next slide. Yeah. Just want to say also that we always talk about social inclusion, and I think that heritage is particularly powerful for that, because it's something which is shared across all citizens. Something people might have different interpretation, they might have different stories behind heritage, they might have a different relationship with heritage. But if you develop the right policies and projects, you can quite easily develop a discussion, develop a conversation around it. So it's kind of focal point, really. And that's something that matters when you develop social cohesion policies. It's not always easy to find the right triggers, and heritage can be that trigger. Yeah, I think the other aspects I won't dwell on them too much. And here as well, I think participatory processes are, for me, at the heart of any policy design. What we see through this Cultural Heritage in Action project is that this is more and more implemented across Europe. And this is quite important as well, because if you look at some of the materials produced throughout the project, you can really have very practical and concrete advice on how to do that, how to involve different communities, how to plan your participatory processes, what kind of discussion platforms should you build in order to really involve different stakeholders seamlessly. So there are lots of tools and resources out there, and I think that if you want to design participatory processes, you're better equipped than ever.
You know, when we speak about these participatory processes, I often think, and I wanted to ask this question to you, this relates very much to funding as well, to securing your funding, because of course, well, an ideal strategy process is that, of course, you map your sector, you define your objectives, you design your strategy, and then you implement it, and you think about financing, maybe that falls from somewhere. For your action, but in many places either the funding is not confirmed, or it's reduced suddenly at the end, or there is no funding at all, and but you still want to create a strategy, and you still, well, you see there is interest from different departments or other players. So in this sense, I mean, do you have any stories, any advice on how to also mobilize financial resources through these participatory processes? Well,
yeah, that's a very good point as well. Thanks for raising this. there is, especially when it comes to heritage, that's a very interesting point, because we have what I call oversized heritage for some cities. You see it quite a lot, you know, this small town with a lot of heritage everywhere. And heritage has quite a cost when it comes to sustaining, preserving, restoring. So very often you've got some national mechanisms, or even European funding can help you to do that. But very often you do see this kind of issue of oversized heritage for compared to the budget of a given town or city. And what you see more and more is kind of some sort of crowdfunding or crowdsourcing of resources to sustain heritage. In the project I was talking about, cultural heritage in action, we saw it in, for example, in the city of Šibenik in Croatia, where there are four fortresses which are quite huge as well, and they used a lot of structural funds money from the EU in order to, let's say, restore them. They've got a sort of private management model which is now profitable, but they also have a Friends Club, which is really a crowdsourcing model, where all citizens have a sort of, all citizens that want to do it have a sort of annual fee, and which is then used in a kind of endowment fund to, let's say, activate smaller heritage across the city. So it's a way for citizens to directly contribute to small heritage pieces which are close to them. We saw it as well in the city of Mérida in Spain, where they have really done a crowdfunding model for heritage, which is both about financing, but also about sharing time, resources, and volunteering work to restore heritage. And that's very interesting as well, because then people engage more with their cultural resources. They feel committed to it, and it's beyond the financial aspect. It's something where it becomes really part of the daily life of many citizens. So those are very interesting models, both in terms of financing, but also in terms of ownership and in terms of engagement with citizens. So yeah, very good point there. To go to the next slide, I'm almost done. Yeah, I think I won't dwell too much on this because I already talked about the kind of shared management model, and we just discussed a bit the financing side, also the ERDF, which is the European Structural Funds. So that's important. Perhaps the only thing I should flag here is the mix of low-cost solutions and heavy investments. So what we see a lot as well is new management models where instead of having, let's say, all the management of cultural institutions within the city, you work with public-private partnerships, or you develop arm's length bodies, or you work with even local associations that are already existing. So you can have a bit more flexibility in terms of, let's say, possibilities to access other sources of financing, be it private funding, crowdfunding, or even European funding to different projects. So there is a bit more, this kind of more flexible management allows you to unlock more resources as well. And that's something that you don't necessarily think about at the beginning. That's also something that you may want to take on board when designing cultural policies and projects. Last but not least, yeah, I think I'm gonna go quickly on that, but just kind of conclusion here. I think first there is now a broader and broader understanding of what the cultural and creative sectors are, what they can do, how they contribute to many aspects. The second point is the articulation between long-term visions and flexibility. That's kind of contradictory, but that's very important. When you develop a cultural strategy, you need to have a long-term vision where you want to be in 10 years' time. But you also need to be able to change quickly. So you need this kind of frequent evaluation, frequent iteration of your policy, because even if the big picture goal hasn't changed. The way to achieve it may have changed in 2 years' time. And I think we just went through a bit more than a year now, and that tells a lot about this. Another element is the role of open spaces, creative hubs, districts, museums beyond the walls. When we are talking about cultural policy, we are talking about a lot of things today, and we are talking about a lot of different open spaces everywhere. And I think that's very important to bear in mind. Cultural policy is not necessarily about museums. It's not necessarily about creative businesses. It might be about that park over there that may become tomorrow the host of the greatest cultural gatherings that you have ever seen in your city. So think broadly as well in terms of cultural spaces. They are everywhere as well. And I think I just finished with the last point. We are talking about creative cities. We are talking about cultural cities. I always say that there is also a new kind of generation here, which is what I call la ville des possibles, the city of the possibilities, of the opportunities, which is about enabling experiments. It's about unleashing initiatives. It's about empowering local creative operators to do things in your city. So it's just about giving them the right space, the right opportunity to act, and they will deliver incredible cultural policies without even thinking about it. And that's a very important point that I want to raise as well. And I think that's it. There is much more to say, but in terms of introduction, that's all I will say.
No, thanks so much. And maybe I'll pick on your last point about giving space to people, and maybe places will regenerate by themselves. But, you know, I had maybe 2 questions for you, and you can pick one or the other. They are quite related. We spoke, well, you touched upon some of this already, but if you are to give like 3 pieces of advice to a national policymaker who is designing a national framework to really support this culture-led strategy making at the local level, what are the key things that should be kept in mind, maybe a little bit beyond the obvious from your experience? And another question, if you want to, comes from other perspective, you know, from the local perspective. You know, when we go to management training, for example, people teach us how to manage down, how to manage across, and then how to manage up as well. So how to work with your bosses, how to work with your superiors to make a change or to really achieve your goals and the goals of your work. So what would be maybe your 3 pieces of advice to local guys, to local governments, how they should interact with the national level? So I don't know, one of the two together.
I think I'll try to find 3. Let's see if I manage or if I find more. But I think first there is a very important element here, which is at national level, there is something that only national governments can do. And when it comes to the cultural and creative sectors, there are some very important regulatory tools as well that shouldn't be neglected. I'm thinking especially of VAT issues, reduced VAT for, let's say, cultural goods and services. I'm thinking of tax incentive schemes as well. We've seen lots of them in the audiovisual sector, for instance, promote film production or film shooting in a given country. That's a powerful instrument if you design it well. And that's something that can pretty much only be done at national level because of the competencies of the national government. And I think that's very useful as well to think about this kind of instruments beyond the audiovisual sector, for instance. So maybe for fashion and design, it can be something that really gives you a huge competitive advantage. We saw it as well for video games, where some countries have developed this kind of schemes. So there are very important opportunities in relation to the kind of fiscal regime that only government can, national governments can put in place. The second advice is similar to what you do for cities and regions. do a study, do a mapping of your local cultural and creative resources. That's the first thing you should do, and based on that, you will have a diagnostic, and you will be able to fine tune what you want. There is also a scale effect. So I said there are things that only a government can do, but similarly, there are, let's say, some types of cultural policy elements that only make sense at national level. I'm thinking of a few things. One of them is, let's say, for instance, support to internationalization. Some city can do it, especially the large metropolis, but most of the time it makes sense to have that at national level. So, for example, support to go to trade fairs, support to residency programs, support to mobility programs rather than residencies. So this kind of really international driven elements are important at national level or at large regional level, let's say. That's an important element. And I think I'll pick up on the second question for the last tip, which is more, how can you manage this kind of different levels of governance, this kind of different policy priorities as well, because you may have as well different political parties at local and national level. So there are many potential issues here. There is one thing which is to sort of try to almost decorrelate some elements of your cultural policies from the more political issues. Meaning that you do need a political vision, that's for sure. You need a clear goal, a clear vision, but then you need also to make sure that when you design the implementation of cultural policies, you sort of avoid having a political landmine in the middle of your implementation plan. So you ensure that either some implementation, some activities are kind of nested within independent cultural institutions, even if they are owned by the city, for instance, but you sort of decorrelate some of your actions from the potential political turmoil. That's one thing. The second thing is also that you can, and sometimes you should, in fact, circumvent one level, meaning if you're a city with, let's say, left-wing government, right-wing government at national level, you may want, in fact, to just swap the national level and go directly to European level or international cooperations. Sometimes it's sad to say, but sometimes it's the only way to achieve anything. We've seen that happening. I don't want to name and shame anyone, but sometimes, unfortunately, you do need to just, let's say, acknowledge that there are differences that won't be easily bridged, and that you just need to sort of skip one step of governance in order to still be able to develop your projects and find the right resources. That would be one important element as well. But that's not one easy thing to do either. So I'm always reluctant to give this advice as well.
Yeah. Well, Arthur, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for this, visionary but also pragmatic discussion. It is always a pleasure to have you with us, and I'm quite inspired, and I hope also, I'm sure our audiences will be so as well. So thank you. And
well, thanks a lot to you as well. And of course, always a pleasure for me as well, really. And I'm sure that what you will develop will be really useful to participants. And I very much look forward to hearing from them as well. If they have any questions for me, they can reach out to me through you, of course. Looking forward, and many thanks again.
Thank you. Then maybe we stop the